Now let's see how we can define a property in Python. The syntax is very simple. First of all, I'll use the function property, and to this function I'll pass three other functions: fget, fset, and fdel, which mean what are the functions that I want to execute when I want to get, set, or delete a value. Doc is an optional argument you can pass or you can ignore if you want to add some documentation string. And this property function will return a property object, and usually we store it in a variable. You can specify its name in a property name. Now let's see in action how we can create a property. In other words, how I can create a property within a class. It's very simple. Assume you define your class, you give it a name, and so on. After that, you will define three methods. One, to define the logic that should be executed when you want to get the attribute. Another method to define the logic when you want to set this attribute. And the last method is the method that will specify what you want to do when you want to delete the value. Look here, when I define a setter method, or the method that is going to be used when I want to set a value, I have to specify the value that I want to assign to the attribute. Now, once I have all of these three methods, you can define your property. And look here, in this case, you can see that property is just a class attribute, and this class attribute has the value of the object that property function returns. And look here, for this property function, as I mentioned before, I have to specify three methods. In this case, I am passing get attribute 1, set attribute 1, and delete attribute 1. Now, and before we move to Jupyter Notebook to see some real examples, I want you to know that there is another way to define a property in Python. In the previous slide, I have shown you how you can define a property using property function, but also we can define it using what we call a property decorator. How I can do that? It's very simple. So the property that I want to add some logic when I want to set or get or delete, I'll define three methods with the same name of this property. So let's assume it's name property name. So here I have one method property name, another method property name, and another method property name. After that, if I want to consider this method, the first one is the getter method, then just I have to use the decorator at property. But for the case of setter and deleter, you have to use the decorator at property.name, at property_name.setter, and at property_name.deleter. I know the syntax is not straightforward and it's a little bit weird, but once you start to use it for a few times, it's going to be easy. At the end, it doesn't matter what is the syntax, but you have to understand the idea. And the idea here, it's very simple. I'm just defining getter, setter, and deleter for the property which has the name property name. And look here, deleter and getter, usually they don't have any parameters except than self, whereas when we have setter, you have to specify the value that you want to assign to the attribute, or in other words, the property in this context. I know that property concept is a little bit weird and hard sometimes, confusing sometimes, but don't worry, because after the code session, you will be very confident about your knowledge in property. So let's move directly to Jupyter Notebook.